This is a continuation of lecture number 10 on the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, we had just finished getting up to the point where we had talked about the predacious form of capitalism that began to develop as early as the 1930s, but it was very controllable because it was very small and it filled an actual need. With the death of Stalin in 1953, this was still a mildly predacious form of capitalism under Mr. Khrushchev, and it lasted until about 1975. At which point I think we could say that we have our little dinosaur of a mildly predacious form has suddenly become a true monster, a real Tyrannosaurus Rex. And the new class itself within Russia, that is within the first economy, the old classless intelligentsia, the technocrats and the managers, they are beginning to transform. And in the period from 1976 to 1990, these two classes, the mafia group from the Georgia area and the new class from Russia proper, from the entire first economy, begin to become intimately interrelated economically, and soon they also begin to intermarry. We reviewed some of those details, and we had pointed out that at the time of the early Khrushchev years, this mildly predacious form of capitalism had not seemed to be a clear and present danger to most people, I think, within party leadership who were already dyed-in-the-wool modern revisionists. There was one man who believed he was. Andropov was his name, and he had been a KGB chief, and he had led a fight against this new class and this criminal element inside the party, especially in the Transcaucasus. But he wasn't able to convince enough of them that this was a true and present, clear and present danger right now. And because the party didn't recognize the fact that these classes were emerging, didn't recognize it officially, then they were somewhat restricted in terms of how they could deal with it. Now, this is a great historical irony because the Bolsheviks have defeated all kinds of powerful enemies, as you'll recall, in the Civil War, and they defeated their domestic enemies and the allies, foreign allies of the domestic enemies. We saw how Stalin had spent those years in the 1920s and 30s getting ready for the inevitable imperialist war. That when the Hitlerites finally did attack, we had fought one incredibly powerful, long war in terms of losses, but in 4 years we'd won that too. Now what they're proposing to do down there is to do what none of these people could do. How are they proposing to do it? Well, it appears as if these mafia chiefs are a lot smarter than anybody had given them credit for, because for years they had been grooming a man named Michael Gorbachev from the Sevastopol region, and he had been rising through the Communist Party as a new kind of star. Well, at any rate, first of all, this second capitalist economy, having been denied to exist by the party, turned out to be one of the biggest problems they had. Now, the key lesson to all of this in the long run is going to be that if you don't get the capitalist economics out of the shadows and into the open world, then it can't very well be contained. The Chinese Communist Party has learned that lesson. When they decided to go to a new economic policy for China, similar to what Lenin had started in 1921 in Russia, they did it with the idea in mind of getting all of these capitalist elements out in the open and regulating them, instead of forcing them into the shadows where they would have to be secretive and many unknown, and the details of their machinations business-wise would be a secret. And if you take a look at the Chinese press today, you'll see that it is full of stories about how the government is policing the capitalist sector. Enough said about that. The second, back to Russia and the republics, of small exchange and service supply functions which had justified leaving the second economy in place under Stalin all along, would have to be replaced, and this was still in the pre-computer era. So the option of computerized total planning and centralization in large-scale planning was just being born at the time that this wholesale introduction of, the introduction of capitalism at the wholesale level, building of housing tracts and factories to supply needs that weren't being supplied in the first economy factories, was one of the things that was taking place. Now, Yuri Andropov was an old Bolshevik, and following Brezhnev's death in 1982, he was elevated to the General Secretary's position of the CPSU. Now, there can no longer be any doubt in my mind that his sudden illness within 3 months of assuming his new position was organized by the Mafia, and it was a medical plot that worked and played out over the coming year like a spy movie thriller, with everybody waiting to see what was going to happen to this great reformer and Yuri Andropov, who was now the head of the Soviet Party. But it turned out to be a year, 1982 to 1983, of the Andropov year, and that was the last chance the Soviet Party had to rectify an otherwise inevitable course of capitalist restoration in the Soviet Union. Why was Yuri Andropov so dangerous to the Mafia and the entire second economy class? Well, first of all, because he was a highly prestigious old Bolshevik. He joined the party nearly a generation after the October Revolution, and he had been mentored by some of Lenin's top men, beginning with Otto Kusenin. Second, because Andropov embodied all the personal traits admired by the party: austere living, dedication to work, a Stalin-like workaholic personality, constant self-education, and he had an impressive history of dealing with the most difficult assignments the party could offer, such as that mess in Hungary in 1956. And finally, fourthly, he had a proven record of policing effectively against the second economy as KGB chief over the previous 15 years, 1967 to 1982. And so he was, most importantly, he was a danger to the Mafia because he proposed a complete and final uprooting and liquidation of the entire second economy. As General Secretary, he would have power to do just that. Accordingly, as far as the Mafia was concerned, I think it's obvious that he had to die. Now, as head of the KGB, Andropov had taken responsibility for the crackdown on dissident intellectuals like Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Andropov's willingness to defend these actions openly and to withstand the criticism of Western commentators and such Soviet intellectuals of Yevgeny Yevtushenko strongly suggested that Andropov could have avoided Gorbachev's blunder of turning the media over to socialist elements. Now, if that was a blunder, I don't think it was a blunder. I think that's exactly what Gorbachev intended. But at any rate, Andropov had already shown that he was an enemy of the Mafia, that he had the courage and conviction of investigating anybody, no matter how high they were, and this had gone up into the investigation into the Brezhnev's daughter and son-in-law. That he didn't hesitate to go after them too when he found out that they were part of, they were involved in all kinds of illicit criminal activities. Now, leading to the decision to elevate Andropov to the position of General Secretary had been the fact that the Politburo and the entire party had been impressed with his theoretical preparation for tackling the problems of constructive socialism in the USSR, which included liquidating the second economy. Belatedly, many in the party, from the leadership on down, were beginning to see the entire second economy phenomenon as a serious threat to Soviet socialism. At least some of them had seen it that way. So the Politburo and Central Committee members who did not yet see the second economy as a clear and present danger still thought Andropov's analysis of the problems of the first economy were correct and that he could set things straight. And they did have a lot of problems in the first economy, as they always would have in a planned economy. Now, Andropov led the way to his call to reform the first and second economies in the following theoretical way. He delivered a series of speeches. In November 1982, he delivered a speech called "The Better We Work, the Better We Will Live." And on December 21st of '82, he did a similar speech on the same topic. On June 15th the following year, analysis of the existing situations and landmarks for the future. And then in 1983 also he wrote a longer treatise on the matter, Karl Marx's Teaching and Some of the Problems of Building Socialism in the USSR. Now, the mafiosos that were running things down there in Sevastopol and Georgia read these papers, they listened to these speeches, and they no longer had any doubts. They had to kill this guy, or he was going to kill them. It was now going to be a struggle to the end, because Andropov was clear. He wanted all the second economy gone altogether, and of course that would be the end of the Russian mafia if that were to happen. Well, he got this deadly disease and he died. Now the next man to come up was Konstantin Chernenko, who, compared to Andropov, was poorly educated and a rather stupid person, and he had to be gotten out of the way too. What they had to have on at the helm was somebody that they could count on, not only not dismantling them, but on dismantling the government itself. And so Chernenko was not a guy that was smart enough to do anything on his own, and so he had to be gotten rid of, and 13 months later he also died of a mysterious disease. Kind of at the time it kind of reminded me of Bobby Kennedy following his brother. But at any rate, then the evil genius himself was in position to do the final job of liquidating socialism. Gorbachev's tenure as head of the party would go from 1985 to 1990, and he is the one that would be able to administer the coup de grace to Soviet socialism. Hitler hadn't been able to do it, the US hadn't been able to do it, none of the capitalist powers of Western Europe had been able to do it, but the one man that could do it was the head of the Communist Party itself. And so the last man standing after the deaths of Andropov and Chernenko was Mr. Gorbachev. So from 1987 to 1991, full-scale restoration of capitalism began in the Soviet Union. It started in January of '87, and within 4 years it would be completed. Now, by the time you finish reading this book, you should be able to see a few things that will be important to you with regard to your own home country, either USA or some part of Latin America or Western Europe. In one sense, this entire process seemed to be, there was hardly any point within it where you could say, up until 1987, that this is the death blow to socialism. But after 1987, it began to become quite clear. Another leading specialist named Tatiana Koryagina has written a book where she has illustrated many of the things that were happening in the first and second economy, statistically, in terms of such things as the growth of the monthly salary of workers compared with the growth of the total size of the money spent on goods and services and saved in the savings banks. These figures are in your textbook, and I'll let you go ahead and read those. But the important thing is that by 1988, the total of the money spent and saved was nearly 7 times greater than the total amount of money earned in the first economy. Well, how could that be? Well, it could only be if you were getting money from second economy sources. Obviously, what Brezhnev had said, none of us live on wages alone, was true. That excessive amount spent and saved had come from the only place it could come from, and that is the second economy, legal and increasingly illegal. Class power and political power was shifting dramatically accordingly. The question of legality was now an academic one. Clearly the present was full of danger of capitalist restoration. And by 1985, only the most determined party police and propaganda assault could have saved the USSR. Instead, the Soviet Union got the great traitor Michael Gorbachev, and he enabled this new form of capitalism, which we saw emerge in 1990, and he himself was followed by another traitor named Boris Yeltsin, who outlawed the Communist Party itself. I don't think after that there could be much much doubt about what the objective of this new crew is, and that the fact that they can get away with it is because they occupy the key positions in the party and the government. Taken together, a variety of monographs provided a kaleidoscopic view of the second economy during the Brezhnev years. Private food vendors sold goods valued at 35.5 billion rubles a year. Soviet barbers in state-owned barbershops customarily collected very high tips, in effect transporting that transaction into the second economy. The home production of grape and fruit, wine, and beer, the illegal resale of state beverages, and the sale of stolen ethanol accounted for as much as 2.2% of the entire gross domestic product for 1979. By the same time, in the late 70s, the black market of gasoline by drivers of state-owned cars and trucks allegedly accounted for between 33 and 65% of all gasoline sales in urban areas. Privately rented housing brought illegal landlords an estimated 1.5 billion rubles in 1977. Tips, bribes, and payments for private services, such as religious ceremonies associated with funerals, involved more than 4 times the amount of money spent on official funerals. Prostitution and illegal drug sales constituted another important part of this second economy. Part of the changing nature of the class structure of the concomitantly changing nature of technology and social organization system mixed on. Even the perhaps 30% in 1989 percentage of the population with income derived primarily from the second economy still had first economy jobs. The rest of the population, that is 70%, whose primary income was from the first economy, still participated at one level or another in the second economy, if in no other way than what capitalist economists would call disposable income. And of course, many persons within that 70% also operated small second economy businesses from home. Now, in a sense, this operation of the second economy was continuing to bring a certain amount of stability to the Soviet regime. As late as 1989, some 96% of the national population, and the party was constantly polling, were all in favor of the Soviet system. The most common comment being, to paraphrase, "What we have is the best system in the world despite all its problems, and we could solve these if we went back to the founding fathers," which in their case they meant Lenin and Stalin. But that kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it, to what we hear in the USA today. Well, it's still the greatest country in the world, but we've got to go back to our founding fathers. Pretty quickly you realize these guys don't have the slightest idea what their founding fathers were doing. And if they did, they probably wouldn't approve. I'm talking about this contemporary Tea Party bunch. At any rate, the second economy has always provided those consumer items the first economy could not provide. Given the party's emphasis on heavy industry, steel, aluminum, electricity, and so on, and then on the light industry devoted to increasing overall production of trucks and tractors, the increasingly prosperous Soviet citizenry had more and more disposable income to get second economy things it wanted after 1975 especially. The first economy guaranteed them a cradle-to-grave annual income covering all their medical and educational, communication, transportation expenses. So what they had left over in salary was disposable income. Even if it doesn't look that big in dollar terms compared to what an American union worker might be making, then that union worker doesn't have all of these other things that he paid for him. So as Gorbachev turned the press over to the most reactionary elements in the country, the citizenry began to become increasingly enticed with the idea that with a certain amount of capitalist restoration, that they could use that money that they had to get all the things they want in the second economy. The loss of control over the press was the most important blow delivered to Bolshevism in the 1985 to 1990 period, and this was part of the Gorbachev plan from the very beginning. So the statistics prove that the party was inundated with every conceivable form of bribery, extortion, subornation, and as a result its high moral character was not only reduced, but in many places it was largely destroyed. So that the believers in the doctrine of communism that is developed by Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin were now reduced to kids and old Bolsheviks, much as Christianity had been reduced to children and old women in the cap countries. This affected the CPSU from the bottom to the very top, as the corruption of the General Secretary Brezhnev's own family proved. Once the party was thoroughly corrupted by this tyrannosaur second economy in the post-1975 period, it was only a hop, skip, and a jump until it could be used to pull the trigger in assassinating the Soviet Republic, and that is exactly what happened in 1989 to 1990. Finance is the gun in class politics. Politics is knowing when and how to pull the trigger. In the case of the assassination of socialism in the USSR, the financial class basis was the complete transformation of the second economy from an adjunct of the first into the driving component of the first. The end of socialism, that is, of the first economy, was guaranteed when the now corrupt party and its corrupted mode of production in the Soviet Union, as the gun, was placed in the hands of the pistolero, Michael Gorbachev, who fired the shots that did away with the last enemy Soviet capitalist mafia bosses confronted, which was the Soviet state and the government itself. So in so doing, Gorbachev did what Hitler had failed to do, or the Americans, or the British and the French in the 1920s. In the meantime, for better or for worse, the lessons of the second economy and its traitors spawned in and out of the party was being learned, and we can see how the transformation of socialism backwards into capitalism of a new form, a newer kind of capitalism, structurally, than had existed before. Now, internationally, people were learning all over the world, but especially within communist parties, what all of this meant, and especially in communist parties in power. Now, in the United States, the Communist Party under Gus Hall just followed the leader, did what it had always done, and did what the Soviet government told it to do, the Soviet Party. But it didn't really matter, because the only time in my lifetime that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, of the United States, was important was when it was leading certain sections of the anti-Vietnam War movement. But other than that, they didn't have any responsibilities. So the parties you want to take a look at are the ones where the Communist Party is in power, especially in China. And in China, these lessons of the capitalist restoration in the Soviet Union and the way it was happening had not been lost. In fact, the Soviet collapse only confirmed the correctness of the policy of controlling capitalism, which the CPC had adopted after the failure of Madame Mao and her group to get production moving in China once again. The CPC had embarked, as you know, upon a totally new road with regard to how to deal with the second economy in its own country 10 years before Gorbachev took power in 1985. And what happened in the USSR, because of the failure to face up to the fact of de facto capitalist growing sectors of Soviet society, was proof in the minds of Chinese party leaders that the road they had pioneered was a correct road. Rather ironic in that Lenin's idea of protecting socialism via a Chinese buffer had proven correct in the end, except that China now had become the homeland of the world socialist stage. The Vietnamese, being as well led as they were, soon followed China's lead, and the Cubans, in a much more dangerous geographical position via U.S. imperialism, had to take a slower road, and only in 2011 did they make the big jump to the Chinese model and avoid the terrible mistakes in the Soviet Union by proceeding very carefully. And Korea, as I've mentioned before, was stuck in an increasingly dangerous stagnation as its own internal structure delayed its transition to the Chinese model even longer than the Cubans. But as of this writing, the Koreans seem to be about to make that move. On the other hand, I've thought the same thing for the last 10 years, so I'm not sure where they're going to go from stagnation. Furthermore, it doesn't really matter in terms of the big experiment going on is in China. And now, the effect of the conflict between imperialism and the new class government in Russia under Mr. Putin has led them to what I suspected it would lead them to for a long time. It's led the Russians to understand that there is no possibility of collaborating long-term with U.S. imperialism. They're going to have to take a stand. They're going to have to reconstitute in some form or another the old Soviet Union, so that the old republics, such as the Ukraine, are brought into a new alliance in the same way that Kazakhstan and Belarus have been, for example. Well, the Mafia had not assassinated Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko because they were playing a dangerous game of Russian roulette. Big-time capitalists of the New York Five family variety, which is exactly what we had at the top of the second economy by 1980, in the USSR, don't take chances and act recklessly like that when their entire family structure and the class behind them, their lives, their way of making a living, are on the line. Furthermore, the Russian Mafia bosses were far better educated and thus made much more intelligent decisions than their Italian counterparts in New York had ever done. And the Russian Mafia bosses had PhD consiglieri, not triggermen, as advisors in numbers 1 and 2. They had plenty of triggermen, but not as advisors. No, the Russian bosses did what they did because they had a Trojan horse waiting in the wings, and that Trojan horse was Michael Gorbachev. The removal in rapid succession of these two general secretaries, Andropov and Chernenko, after Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev, had, however, unwittingly cleared the way by putting the first economy into a tailspin of stagnation, and this was no accident. The Mafia High Command, equivalent to the U.S. National Crime Commission of Meyer-Lansky, was confident in their Trojan horse because they had had their man, Gorbachev, living virtually under their wing all of his life. The only time Gorbachev was not physically under their direct influence was when he was in college in Moscow. So the Mafia bosses down here in Georgia and Sevastopol, they knew Gorbachev very well, and he knew what he was supposed to do. And what he had to absolutely do was to maintain his cover as a communist and then work his way up inside the party, a true Trojan horse, until he was in a position to launch his counter-revolution. Gorbachev himself was born in 1931, so that was long after the revolution, and it was at the beginning of the mass collectivization. And he was born in about 124 miles from the city of Stavropol in that region of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. Now, this is right next to that part of the Transcaucasus where so many Bolshevik leaders had begun their career, like Stalin, for example, and Beria, or Voroshilov, Kalinin. We've named these guys before. At any rate, so Georgia was a hotbed of Mafia thugs and Bolshevik revolutionaries. Now, the city of Stavropol itself was an early example of Soviet industrial success. It's a place where the party poured a lot of money and effort into the collectivization. So, for Gorbachev, as a young man growing up, he'd never known any form of agriculture other than collective farms, and by the time the war came about, World War II, he was still only 14 years old, so he was just a little too old to be drafted. And but he was old enough to see many of the suffering that was going on because of the Nazi occupation, short as he was. But 7 of his relatives had been raped and killed by the Germans in the countryside and in the city of Stavropol. So he has a lot of things going for him, and in terms of why he should be promoted inside the Communist Party. And in 1950, 5 years after the war had ended, he graduated from high school. He did a collective farm stint that summer of 1950 as a tractor station employee. He did a good job out there, got an award at a Banner of Labor. He was one of those kind of kids that goes and does the very best he can at any job he's given. And with these recommendations in hand, he was accepted into the Lomonosov State University in Moscow, LSU, not Louisiana State University, but Lomonosov State University. He received his degree in law there, and he was never a practicing lawyer, but this was one way of rising in the politics of the Soviet Union, the same way many lawyers use their law degree as a stepping stone into the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate. And so that's where he was. Now his career centered for 23 years after his college graduation in Moscow and in Stavropol, where he obtained his second college degree in agronomy and specialized in leading the party effort at mechanizing agriculture and developing the industrial infrastructure, building vacation resorts, as well as overseeing many of the rest of the government tasks of his Soviet region. Well, the agronomic part, of course, would fit very well with the first economy. But this idea of building vacationing resorts, that's a purely mafia undertaking, same way as it is in the U.S. In Las Vegas. You don't think any of those casinos out there are owned by college boys that got a degree, an MA in business administration. So, for one thing, nobody knows how to run a casino except for a gambling specialist from the mafia. So you might have some college boys here and there to take care of some accounting if you think that you can let them into the accounting room. But the building resorts in Russia was like building resorts in Las Vegas, which shows us that he had, by 1970, he already had these well-established ties with the very people that had overseen his rise within the government and the party in the southern part of the Soviet Union. So, in that Stavropol region, by the way, had about 2.4 million people in it at that time. So at that time he was elected to the Federal Congress, that is the Supreme Soviet, and in 1971 he was co-opted under the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which was a big step up for a kid that, well, for a young man that was only 40 years old. That's the kind of, well, he was appointed chief of the Agricultural Department of the Central Committee and became a protege of Yuri Andropov, this hardline, wanting to liquidate all of the second economy privateers he can guy. So not only was he head of the Agricultural Department of the committee, but he was personally being mentored by Yuri Andropov, who was an old Bolshevik of, well, post-Lenin generation. Now, in 1971, Gorbachev was elevated to the party's highest authority in 1979, and that was the Politburo. When the next 10 years, he would oversee the dismantling of the Soviet Union and the outlawing of the CPSU. And it all began along these lines in 1985, after, I say, the deaths in quick succession of Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko. Now, the point I wanted to make here is, from 1978, when he became the Agricultural Department chairman for the Central Committee, and was clearly a protege of Yuri Andropov, it's only 1 year until he's elevated to the Political Bureau, and 79, and it'll be another 6 years before he takes the position as party chief. And it sounds like a long time, but it isn't really. It's just a fast track for a young man on his way up within the party structure. Now, nothing in Gorbachev's public, party, and government career could have made his colleagues suspect disaffection from Marxism, Leninism, or a tendency towards social democratic thinking. That is, nothing other than the fact that he traveled widely in Europe, but was influenced by Czech and Italian Communist Party thinking. The problem is, within a modern revisionist setup, this is all right. So, as long as you pay lip service to the other ideas of Leninism, they don't have any objection to you entertaining these new, obviously revisionist ideas coming out of Italy and Czechoslovakia. The Chinese thought so little of the Italian leadership, Mr. Togliatti, that they had written 2 great big papers about it, on the differences between Togliatti and us, more on the differences between Togliatti and us, each about 40,000 words, each dealing with all of the theoretical issues. To them, there was nothing, everything about that business was suspicious. But in Moscow, under the different slide rule that they're using, what Gorbachev, to the degree that he had anything to say along these lines, was not anything that they didn't already think themselves, if maybe they hadn't been brave enough to say it. The Stavropol part of the Soviet Union's second economy was bigger than the second economy in any other part of the Soviet Union, with the exception of the Georgian Soviet Republic, which is right next, borders on the Stavropol region of the USSR. So outwardly, Gorbachev gave every expected sign of being orthodox as Andropov, and was far more bureaucratically capable than hacks like Brezhnev and Chernenko, but was in the most subverted part of the Soviet Union in terms of the activities of the Russian mafia. Now, upon taking the helm, Gorbachev started out by referring to Andropov's initial November 22nd, 1982 speech, which we just mentioned, where he had been taking on the economic problems of the USSR as a keystone for his administration, and he gave the impression of wanting to, Gorbachev now gave the impression of wanting to pick up where Andropov could have left off. And that's pretty much the way Russians at least understood it, and foreign observers in the United States might have looked at it that way. The Chinese did not, but that's another matter. Nothing could have been further from the truth as the next disastrous 5 years played out than that he was going to try to duplicate what the road Andropov had set off on. Now, within the arena of international affairs, at precisely the moment of the Carter-Reagan offensive against the socialist system, it was now at its high point, and Gorbachev began making a series of concessions to the USA, which only weakened the Soviet position. Under these two capitalist regimes, that is Carter and Reagan, a Stalin-like crass-total attitude of tit for tat and massive reinvestment in heavy industry and defense industry was what was called for, but Gorbachev did exactly the opposite. Let's look at what the capitalists did to subvert the Soviet Union in these Gorbachev years. As we'll see in chapters on U.S. imperialism 23 through 28, which we've already talked about a little bit in this lecture series, the North American colossus had complete and total control over Saudi Arabia after World War II. And this meant over most of the Arab world's oil, and that meant also over most of the OPEC world's oil. Working with that tool in hand, U.S. imperialism drove down the world price of oil by being sure that the Saudi oil spigot was turned on at full production, meaning low prices. And what this did was to cut Soviet foreign currency reserves by 50%. In other words, they were getting, because the U.S. drove down the price on the international market of oil, they were only getting now 50% of what they had gotten the year before. In hard dollar terms, this meant that $20+ billion in annual foreign currency accumulated in the USSR was reduced to by about $10 billion from $20 billion. Simultaneously, the U.S. imperialists picked up the gauntlet against Poland with the CIA, AFL-CIO Solidarity Front organization, and Afghanistan, creating the Al-Qaeda jihadist movement it directed against the most progressive government Afghanistan has ever had or would ever have for generations to come, which required another $10 billion US dollars, or its equivalent rubles, to be sent to both these countries, that is, both Poland and Afghanistan. Suddenly the USSR was back in pre-collectivization, that is, pre-1928 levels of financial capability. Thirdly, simultaneously to this, USSR, the U.S. ruling trillionaire oligarchy continued in policy making of relative peace with the PRC, the People's Republic of China, as the price of breaking up socialist solidarity with the USSR on its eastern front. Now, the Chinese had no objection to being left alone. Undoubtedly, they saw the Gringo approach as a temporary rapprochement in pursuit of the Rockefeller et al. Overarching objective, the Wolfowitz-Kagan gang policy of bringing down the socialist country most competitive with them first for global domination. And as it had been since the end of World War II, effectively preventing Gringo imperialism from achieving its principal international objective of total global hegemony. So while China was no military or financial threat to the revisionist leaders of the USSR, it was of no assistance either. So the imperialists had succeeded in dividing the socialist camp in half, with the majority of its population unengaged. That is, the Chinese population, which had been an integral part of the world's socialist camp, is now unengaged under under Gorbachev. Now, during all of this, the international communist movement, not to mention the even broader international working class movement, went into stagnation, confusion, misdirection, as years of revisionist control resulted in a party membership uneducated, unknowledgeable, with dishonest leadership, self-interested, pandering bureaucrats for leaders. And the CPUSA is only one example of all of this, a less important example perhaps because it's not in power, but an important player in the sense that it has traditionally been an agency by which the Soviet government could influence the U.S. government one way or another. The contending parties such as Progressive Labor and the Revolutionary Communist Party were confused and uneducated also, and they went immediately off onto the naive ultra-left path, which initially took Madame Mao as their leader. Everywhere else, the communist movement splintered into multiple parties, so that in Italy, what had been the largest West European party split into 3 parties. And again, on a worldwide basis, the same was true. Fifthly, there was economic direct sabotage of the USSR industrial plant by the U.S. imperialists. They went on a long and intricate program of sabotaging the economy of the Soviet Union in a few obvious ways, where they purposely sold computer chips to the Soviets to sabotage everything that those chips were inserted into. They sold faulty industrial equipment to the Soviet government, purposely created and shipped to USSR as part of the Gringo collaboration in opening up the Soviet Union via trade. Opening up was the phrase Gorbachev used for his restructuring and opening up were called perestroika and glasnost. The U.S. sabotaged blueprints for gas turbines, which they had created. The CIA had arranged them to be sabotaged in such a way that when they sold to the Russians, they wouldn't know about it until after they got them installed. This is a very active program of sabotage that's being directed against the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev's economic policies made it possible for them to insert all of this bad computer chips and bad engineered sabotaged equipment into the Soviet economy. What Gorbachev called restructuring, that is perestroika, took the factor of centralization as the key problem facing the government, and his programs began dismantling what was in fact the most successful part of the Soviet government. So, using anti-corruption measures as a cover, that's what he called them, and some of the initial assaults on party and government bosses were correct and had been initiated by the Cheka under Andropov, were to dismantle key bureaucratic institutions such as the Ministry of Instruments, where Gorbachev fired 1,000 technical workers, fired 150,000 industrial managers, fired 1/3 of the first and regional district secretaries, that is over 50, and fired 14 of the 25 Central Committee department heads along with their staffs, and often obliterated their functions. 40% of the USSR's ambassadors were fired overseas. Over half the Politburo's full and candidate members were dismissed. Gorbachev had both disarmed his opponents and dismantled the party and government structure in his first 3 months in power. Simultaneously, Gorbachev began to turn the media over to the most fascist elements within the country. Contrary to his history of ideological orthodoxy, he now turned 180 degrees in the opposite direction. Everything was wrong here, not the least being the almost overnight introduction of capitalist concepts of the good life, which most Soviet citizens were only vaguely aware of, and this precisely at the time that the U.S. imperialists had stepped up the massive radio broadcasting into the USSR, encouraging all sorts of sedition, spreading all sorts of envy, creating jealousy about living standards. Then Gorbachev enabled the entire U.S. radio program campaign to go ahead by stopping Soviet jamming. Hitler in Moscow could not have been worse. Theory and Method 1, Causality and Process. It's time to review our theory and method, and in doing so we should always begin with dialectical materialist epistemology, that is, the theory of knowledge of dialectical materialism. And the first principle therein is that the causation must always be sought internally for any given phenomena, not externally. That is, primary causation, again, must be sought internally. What's the difference between primary and secondary causation? Well, let's take a look at, for example, an environmental change may trigger a specific event. The way in which phenomena evolve, the phenomena involved subsequently evolves. That is, the locus of primary causation is determined first by whatever a phenomenon's internal structure may be. The conditioning causation, the secondary causation, is what that primary cause happens within. In other words, environmental causes, in this case the international social environment, is as much of an environment as the earthly natural reaction, but it can only be secondary or conditionally causal. In real-world terms, the reaction of hunting and gathering Paleolithic bands to the environmental change at the end of the Pleistocene was often migration. Now, this is my first professional paper in archaeology was called A New Light on the Prehistoric Southwest, and what it had to do with primary and secondary causation in what was happening there. Now, let's take a look at this forest and the trees thing again. When the climate in the Great Basin of the United States began to dry up at the end of the Pleistocene, roughly 9,500 to 10,500 years ago, hunting and gathering bands could have done several different things. But this is happening over a period of centuries, so you have plenty of time to migrate if you want to in the wintertime you might want to go to one area, in the summertime another, and so on, depending on how the climate is reacting. Another thing, that is without changing your hunting and gathering mode whatsoever. Another way of reacting to it would be if you had developed grinding stone technology and you were grinding the seeds of wild plants in any particular area of the Great Basin, you might be able to say, well, what we're going to do is eat bread this fall instead of meat, and we'll just stay right here. The point is, geographic climatic change is a secondarily causal factor. What's really determining what a society's response is going to be is the degree of the development of its productive forces, and that is where the primary causation lies. So that was the point to all of this, and the same relationship between primary causation and secondary causation exists in all cultures. That's just one that's fairly easy to understand, at least for me, because that's how I started out in archaeology. Our general theory is that of historical materialism, and we know that humanity, unlike previous biological forms, adapts to its environment culturally. That is, with tools and collective use of them and ideas about the world we live in as a buffer between us and the environment. Now, in this way, humanity departs from all other views of society and its culture and our history. We Bolsheviks differ from all of these other people in that regard. Archaeology in particular, and anthropology in general, has proven that humanity has socially and biologically evolved through a series of stages. At the moment, the globe is evolving from capitalism and the transitional socialist stages, what I've called Stalinist socialism, for example, to the stage of communism. And this is a scientific fact written into stone, as certain as Darwin's proof that biological forms evolved as a consequence of natural and sexual selection, acting upon variation in the species. Now, variation itself established by errors, the mutations in the replication of the DNA, which carry all hereditary data of living things on the earth. As I say, in the case of cultural and social evolution, the phenomena being studied is culture, and culture is the totality of learned behavior, which in its general manifestation is always structurally composed of a mode of production and a superstructure. And in specific anthropological terms, that means the forces and relations of production, the technology, and social organization that make up the mode of production are always accompanied by an affected change in the superstructure, and vice versa. That is what culture is, and that's how it operates. Now, we have to apply that to what we're talking about with regard to the collapse of the Soviet Union. As I say, the foregoing, what we've talked about, is just elementary Marxism, and it's all the more important at this point, because to understand the collapse of what happened in the USSR and its East European dependencies, the people's democracies, that Stalin established in Joseph Stalin's cookie-cutter way, we don't want to be all over the page. But instead, we got to be looking for the first internal factors, which are important. We have to analyze the collapse process first at the general level of evolution of these three components of culture, and then we must have a specific theory of collapse. That must be a theory based on class analysis. Why class analysis? Because we know from our general theory that the servitude epoch, in the servitude epoch, it is a class struggle, which is the primary internal source of causation. It was the growth of the second economy and the capitalist classes behind it which doomed the USSR fundamentally. In other words, in this case, it was the Soviet Union's primary internal structure of class division, the third stage new class itself, which was the prime mover, that is, the locus of primary causality. The first source of failure to prevent socialist collapse was in failing to admit that the Soviet Republic, and from 1924 the Soviet Union, always had an internal class structure. The final source of failure to prevent social collapse was in always failing in this regard, and its counterpoint, which was the false assertion when it was made that classes and class struggle in the USSR had ceased to exist, whereas in reality class division evolved and deepened throughout the history of the Soviet Union. And we have discussed how some of that happened. We can divide the history of that class struggle into two parts, and in fact we've reviewed the emerging Soviet Union in historical terms sufficient for the task at hand in chapters 13 through 16. Chapter 17 prepared us for this discussion, but taking us through the post-World War II years and the USSR jockeying for global supremacy, that is, capitalism versus Stalinist socialism, jockeying for global supremacy. And then in chapters 23 to 28, we went through the class struggle in the USA itself. For now, I shall summarize the outlines of the evolution of the class struggle within the Soviet Union. The first 36 years of Soviet power, 1917 to 1953, in terms of the mode of production, technology, and social organization. To begin with, in the history of the mode of production in the Soviet system, you will recall that the Bolshevik Revolution was a proletarian revolution in intent and led by the Proletarian Party. But in practice, as Lenin pointed out all along, a revolution was a bourgeois revolution of the farming masses at the beginning. He means that the farmers being petty bourgeois, small capitalist farmers in the main, and all bourgeois, if we include the large capitalist farmers, middle and big, then the agrarian bourgeoisie were the bulk of Bolshevik support at the beginning. And this made it a bourgeois revolution. It's for this reason the Bolsheviks were successful, as Lenin points out. That is, the Bolsheviks marched, in Lenin's words, with the mass of the Russian population. The revolution liquidated the feudal parasite nobility and city magnate landowners, absentees, and in the aftermath of the Bolshevik seizure, when state power was in our hands, we saw the liquidation of the rich capitalist farmers. This left by 1922 only small and very small capitalist farmers. To continue with that agricultural setting, we had in 1922 a situation where 90% of the Soviet population existed in capitalist agriculture. Some of the middle farmers became rich farmers once more, and we saw they were given their old name, the kulaks, or the fists. These kulaks were liquidated as a class beginning in 1928, in that as a class they were rounded up and sent to Soviet Central Asia or Siberia to begin again as common farmers, not allowed to return for 5 years. If and when they and their offspring did come back, they were specifically excluded from participating in the collective farms, and this meant that after 1928 they were excluded from farming. Upon return, they'd have nowhere to go, so most of them didn't come back, but the students would go ahead and go to get higher education, or many of their kids would. So, simultaneously, within the urban population, there were true proletarians now employed by the government, and we reviewed the growth of NEP and its subsequent transformation into all government enterprises under the 5-year plan in Chapter 15. However, simultaneous to this growing urban proletarianization via government employment in all key industries of the first economy, we saw that there was also growing an urban second economy. Now, the latter began as largely a black market economy under war communism. that huge sections of the second economy became legal under NEP. At the same time as the legal second economy capitalism was allowed and in fact encouraged to thrive, there was a necessary second economy in the shadows. However, the line between those two was always rather arbitrary, in that they both handled all forms of small exchange that backward Soviet Russia and its associate Soviet republics cannot possibly handle as part of the first economy. For this reason, the second economy, or shadow portion, was allowed to exist, and its government and state police were appropriately chaperoned into this. In the 1920s, there was warfare between the old bourgeois specialists, the new Bolshevik wannabe managers. That was finally resolved when all of these new jobs were created. And the growth of this petty bourgeois shadow second economy was therefore kept in check by the police and by the reality that there was very little disposable income available to the workers and their managers in the first economy to spend anyway. So without money to spend on things in the shadow economy, that economy was restricted in size and shape by objective financial reality, and in a way analogous to the way a governor restricts rotation in machinery. Scarcity acts as a socio-economic governor under Stalinist socialism. The superstructure of the ideological class war is another matter, but throughout all of this Soviet history there were distinct social classes, because there were distinct different classes of whole people who had a different relationship to the means of production and to the subsequent articles production and distribution. The class war was always being fought out ideologically as fiercely as in the press and in the media as it was in the industrial arena. In the Soviet Union, the first feature of this ideological class war was that the party constantly exhorted the nation toward classless society. Sometimes overzealous party intellectuals insisted that the Soviet Union's legal structure was equivalent to actually having eliminated classes. And to the degree this latter absurdity was actually believed, this was self-delusion of the worst type and certainly not Marxist nor Leninist. This is the origin of the denial of classes and class struggle, which would eventually be the death knell tolling of the bell for the Soviet system. The reason for this fatal attraction to the line that the ideal was the objective reality goes back to the beginning of Bolshevik power. Regardless of its utility at the beginning, it became the drug of wishful thinking. A drug that, surely as morphine, can go from a wonderful pain reliever in emergency to a lethal addiction. An ideological drug that dulled our party's senses to what an objective observer from another planet might have considered an obvious path to self-destruction. Why? What do I mean by that? How mechanically did it actually come to pass? Well, in the beginning, that is after October 24-26, 1917, there was little the Bolshevik Party could do beyond keeping campaign promises about land to the farmers, abolishing ranks of the army, except cosmetic things. For example, where names were changed about everything. Ministries became commissariats. Officer ranks were democratized in title. We've gone over all that before and won't do it again, but the capitalist press slogans were proletarianized. But cosmetic changes were about all a working class government could do if the objective reality of a highly industrialized capitalist substrate with a corresponding mass proletarian population did not exist, which it didn't. So, art form over substantive reality was the core of the ideological war conducted by Bolshevik propaganda. So you can see that there was a long tradition in the Bolshevik Party by the time that this 1975 rolled around, that to the effect of, well, if we say this is socialist, then it is. If we say this is a classless society, then it is. That was carrying things a little too far, because it disarmed the party at the very time that it needed to be super alert to the emergence of this new mafia-run second economy class, which was becoming the core of the income of most of the people in the Soviet Union.